Islamic support. That's what English, but we don't call it Islamic. I mean, Egyptians in the 19th century Cairo didn't say this is Islamic Cairo, this is nonsense, right? But this is the naming that was given onto it. And then the downtown or 19th century or modern expansion, whatever you call it, those two come together as the urban core. The first, I'll just give you an outline of what I have in mind for where we should go. So that you have an idea. So I'll just give you sort of like the big stops so that you have a listed there, which is actually just across from here, but we're going to move to get to there. And then Abdeen Square, and then walk down Ahmad-Din Street to Azbakiyya and Ataba, and then from there we'll get onto a bus, loop quickly through Zamalek and Mohandisin, and then end up in the Citadel area where May will take over to sort of lead the second half of the walk, or the tour. Alright, so start.
And then I said, wow, I have to get really up early. And, so I will see if I get up. I can.
Everybody, look up and close your eyes. Alright, so obviously in Tahrir, there are a few points that one can make. Contested space, I think this is sort of a contested space par excellence, in the sense that over the last 2.5 years, there's been different social groups, political groups fighting for sort of laying claim over this space. It's also become a space that went through several other transformations, including sort of becoming known more recently as a spot for sexual harassment. So given a particular geography to a particular kind of harassment. But also, it's very interesting because it was closed for about 3.5 months, most recently, and it just opened last week, which raises questions about the need for the square to continue its life as a traffic circle, which is what it has been for the last, I don't know, 50 years or so. These are questions that are open-ended. They haven't been responded to or answered fully, but I think it's an important thing to think about. How is it that a square that was so central to the traffic flow of the city gets closed for about 3 months, and more than once? It happened last year, it happened again this year, and somehow the city, yes, not so smoothly, but it manages to function without it. I mean, it's just something to think about. Is there a potential for this square to become a pedestrian square all the time again and sort of be planned as such? I'm not sure. The square has a long history. I don't want to sort of turn this into a historical tour either, but I'll just point out to a few things. Obviously, the Egyptian Museum is the anchor for this space. This, where we're standing 170 years ago, would have been marshland, meaning the water would have come up this way up until 1868 or so, 65, when the river edge was fixed. Before that, when the river flooded, the water used to come up quite significantly, quite a significant distance into the land, which made this undevelopable, I guess, if that's a word. So once the river edge was hardened, the Egyptian military built barracks on this side, on the river, which 10 or 11 years later, when the British occupied Egypt, they used it as their headquarters, as their military headquarters. So the reason I'm giving this background is to say two things. One is that one can argue that this has been a contested space for as long as we know sort of the square as an urban space, not just like another land outside the city core. The city core was, of course, much further inland, where we'll end up at the second half of the tour. But once this became part of the city map in a way, it was always a contested space because of its military association. But also the odd placement of the Egyptian Museum next to military barracks kind of gave the space let's say, functionality. So it wasn't just a military space, it was also an elite culture space. And then urban development slowly grew towards the edge. Of course, the barracks were torn down in 1947 when the British officially left Egyptian cities, which opened up the space for development. And the regime at the time, the monarchy at the time had some plans, and there were competitions for what to do with the space, and were never fully realized. And then 52 happened, and then what you see, those three landmark buildings right there, occupied that space that was left behind from the barracks and its grounds. Okay, so we're in Talat Harb Square. This is probably one of the main squares in this part of the city. It's one of 9 similar kind of urban, from urban morphology point of view, there's 9 of these kinds of squares. Roundabouts about this kind of scale, but this is probably the most famous of them. I just wanted to point a couple of things that we passed by. You've noticed how pedestrian unfriendly even this part of town, which was designed with pedestrians in mind. Again, this is a 19th century urban expansion before cars, so the streets were laid out with pedestrians in mind, hence the relatively wide sidewalk for Cairo. Nonetheless, today with the current urban management, you saw just crossing 2 streets, it wasn't necessarily the safest or most pedestrian-friendly experience, mostly because there's no mediators between vehicular traffic and foot traffic, meaning no traffic lights, which seems like an obvious intervention that anybody interested in sort of, I don't know, controlling traffic, because I think all the discourse about how out of control traffic, with how many people there are, the scale of the city, the fact that things as simple as traffic lights are not in place, it's actually kind of amazing that it functions at all. So I think interventions that seem obvious but somehow never really are part of budgets, whatever, like traffic lights, would actually have, I think, a huge improvement. So this is one point. The other point, we passed by what some of you obviously know if you live in Cairo, the food cart. Cairo has a very long history of street vending and on-street eating. I was recently last October in New York, and there was an exhibition at the New York Public Library that was all about street food, and immediately I thought of the food cart. The food cart is really an urban feature. It shows up in the morning. It has a particular aesthetic. It serves a particular dish. It's accessible to anyone. But then it disappears at a certain amount of the time of the day, and then other forms of food, street food, make it to the street. So this is an interesting part of the urban, also sort of landscape, let's say. But then it links to another form of street vending, which has more recent, let's say, history. This street, particularly in the evening, has become a street market for street vendors who sell relatively cheap clothing. We've always had, like I said, street vending, but this form of street vending is relatively new. After the revolution, with the lack of municipal control and policing, basically it's not really like the police was in control, but it was more about the police having relationships with the shop owners, so they kept the street vendors away because the shop owners paid bribes so that the police do their job, and this was no longer happening. So then street vendors start to take on more and more space and actually encroaching all the way to the middle of the street sometimes in the evening, so that you have one lane of cars left. It's been interesting because it's been mostly on this one street, which raises questions: why not on Asr al-Nil Street, which is this one? Why just on Talat Harb Street? I don't know. I don't have an answer. But also, it has created an interesting dynamic between the street vendors and the shopkeepers, where there's a negotiation happening. Of course, this has become a bit bougie point of discontent, where all the middle class people are complaining about all these, people selling cheap Chinese clothes or whatever. They're in our way. They're stealing our public space. I think I understand that perspective, but also it's not responding really to why there's a massive informal street vending market and what is this economy part of, like a real discussion of what the street vending phenomena post-revolution has not really taken place, I think. But it's just something to think about. But since we're here, I want to say three things quickly. One is some of you have this, which is the Downtown Contemporary Arts Festival, which is happening all this month. It's a recent initiative that started last year. You'll see all the partners, but behind it is really one investment company that's trying to bring upper income, let's say, buyers back into this part of the city, whereas for the last 40 years or so, there's been a concerted, I would say, policy to migrate those with money into either enclosed pockets like Zamalek, Maadi, and Heliopolis. They've become much more self-enclosed and self-contained to some degree, not fully, but to some degree, or the other alternative, which is to just move out of the city altogether. If you're a young couple also and you want to get married and you want to take a loan to buy an apartment, nobody will give you a loan to buy an apartment downtown, but you will be able to get a loan to buy a car and to move out into the desert. So that's an interesting, I think, policy-related issue. So downtown is being recently activated with some of these kinds of events. It's been happening for the last 15 years or so. Heba is one of the founders of one of the many art institutions in downtown that have decided to be in downtown, not in any other part of the city. So there's been a kind of a movement to bring some foot traffic from a diverse economic groups, let's say, into downtown. But recently, Ismailia, as a development company, has been a bit more vocal and visible. And the Arts Festival is one way to do this. The other thing is Victoria with GUC. They've also been interested in downtown, and maybe she can say a couple of words about her downtown centric studies and the summer school program, which is going to happen for about a month, I think, in June,
yeah.
right? Yeah. So.
Okay, shortly, our idea was that this is on a private university, and one of the topics which was not addressed yesterday is that a lot of people are kind of afraid of the city. And so you have very different social classes which are not interacting a lot. Okay, I'm sorry. For example, our students are mainly living in the new town outside Cairo, moving to the campus, which is also in Masri in Tagam Khamis, and they are absolutely not. They are not comfortable to coming to downtown, to coming to Islamic Cairo. So we started one project, which is this one, Take a Coffee with Your Heritage. And the idea was to take one of the agua here around, do small changes inside, producing stickers, flyers, postcards about building of downtown, and using this small object to start talking with the people. And so we have regular meeting now in this agua, which is in the Mohamed Mahmoud Street. And the students are coming and doing interview, talking about the building, talking about where are the parents living, since when did you move here, and trying to understand the mechanisms of architecture and people living there. And for us, it's a very interesting experiment to bring the students in this area and to make them comfortable to be here and to talk with the people and interact with them. We still don't know what we will do with all these interviews. Maybe, I don't know. So if somebody has some ideas and want to help us, it's
Post them on Cairo Observer.
Yeah, why not? And the second project is a summer school. We will start in the 15th of June until the 26th. It's fully granted by the DAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, and it will be in cooperation with the University of Stuttgart. And we will do, we will research the history of the building, the history of the building typologies. So the idea is to do also some surveys of flats to understand is it really European, this architecture, or are the building typologies different from what we know from Europe? How are the flats inside? And then at the same time, interview with the people in the sense that try to link the history of the building with the history of the inhabitants. And the big target will be to publish a guide about downtown, the architecture and the people. So we are very much looking for cooperation, collaboration and everything. So if you think you could contribute to this summer school in some way, I'm happy to collect your name and contact you back in June.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. So as Victoria mentioned, if anybody wants to buy a musical instrument, please do it now. Um, okay, so just a quick comment, actually two related comments, which touch on what Vittoria mentioned. One is about the urban history of this part of the city, and the other one is about heritage, which is obviously building on that history. This part of the city in scholarship has been so, I think, misrepresented. There's been, mostly because of the tradition of who has been studying urban form and urban history of Egypt. It's been mostly non-Egyptians for a very long time, who've also used only European sources and European references, who have also been, I think, very shallow in their reading of architecture and urbanism, simply by looking at facades and associating them as having a point of reference elsewhere that's somehow inauthentic, because of course Egypt is an unchanging Oriental Islamic something or another, so this doesn't belong. I mean, a similar argument can be made today, let's say, about the desert cities. Are the desert cities, I mean, they obviously have to do with Egyptian economy, Egyptian policy, Egyptian consumers, Egyptian planners. So yes, there might be a similar development happening elsewhere, but we're part of a connected universe, a global sort of design and market. I mean, we know what's happening. Everybody knows what's happening elsewhere, so why should things look drastically different? At the end of the day, they will be grounded in their location. And I would say this is the same with 19th century Cairo. Yes, like Khaled was saying yesterday, there is the sort of obsession with a European reference and so on, but obviously there are other aspects of it. I'll just say quickly that this contested heritage has actually contributed to its negligence, mostly because people didn't necessarily feel like they belong or that this represents an authentic part of Egyptian history, so it has become so much easier to neglect and move and sort of disassociate from 19th and 20th century heritage, which I find to be very problematic. For example, downtown has a very high percentage of buildings that were built after 1952 fire, but that history has become almost erased. We just associate everything with somehow earlier 19th century visions of downtown. Not true. So anyway, so the urban history is complicated, and the heritage question is very relative, which I think will also filter into what Mai will talk about, because it's not only this part of the city whose heritage is contested, even the actual Islamic core's heritage is contested. This is just a very quick points to make here. One is that this is the Borsa area. Borsa is the stock exchange, what's referred to as the Khedive Stock Exchange building is down here. It's an early 20th century building. Also the National Bank and the Central Bank, all these institutions were here. So this was kind of like the early 20th century financial district. Since then, as you may know, a lot of these institutions moved out. The Borsa stayed down here, although there was an attempt about 10 years ago to move it into this massive, mammoth, hideous concrete project that was going to be at the foothill of the Citadel, which was a big contested project, obviously because of the location, and anyway, but that never happened. But the reason we're here is because it's one of the attempts by the governorate, by the state, to pedestrianize parts of downtown. As you see, it's been pedestrianized. They put some palm trees, and slowly it has become sort of a cafe, a network of cafes. There are 34 cafes in these streets, and at night this is completely full. Almost. There are different areas, different parts of the streets that attract different audiences, whether it's sometimes there's like a Sudanese cafe, sometimes there's I don't know, more of a women's cafe, there's even a kind of a gay-ish area. So it depends on who's who. They sort of have self-created zones within this area, which is interesting. But all of this is informal, and nobody has sort of planned it this way. It just happened. Partly, I think one way to understand it is because of this meeting between a top-down vision, which is the state coming in without really consulting anybody and deciding, okay, we're going to pedestrianize these streets, pull some palm trees, and this is our vision of a financial district downtown. And then not really going all the way through with a vision. So then people, fill in the blanks, they complete it. Of course, a lot of the businessmen didn't necessarily want to be here, and they said, oh, downtown, again, because of its association in, the 2000s, it's not the same as what it meant in the early 20th century, so it didn't really pick up as a business district. The financial exchange is actually not happening here anymore. They still have the main building, but it's also moved out to the desert into something called Smart Village, which is a gated campus in the middle of the desert that looks like it landed from space. You go in the middle of the desert and it's everything glass architecture, which is not very efficient for the location. And the grass looks like greener than California. It makes absolutely no sense. But that's where the actual stock exchange transactions are happening. So it's an interesting question about what does this mean? What do we do with it now? What policy, design, how do you sort of work with what's been done and what's happened since? The other thing that I wanted to mention here quickly is that one of the interesting initiatives, this just launched this week. It's a hyper-local newspaper and it's only for Bursa area, which I find to be a really interesting and a desperately missing sort of kind of element, this idea of a local paper. Hyper-local is even going another dimension. This is not about downtown, it's just about Bursa. And it's a free paper. It's commercial, so it has advertising from all the local shops, but it also has stories about and sort of features. Let's say I have a few copies. Whoever wants one, but I just thought this is an interesting sort of intervention.
Was this kind of area originally designed and thought of as a pedestrian area?
Originally?
Yeah, originally.
I don't think originally, no. I don't think so. Okay, so from here we'll move down the street. Just since we're here, this wasn't part of my plan, but I'll just say something really quickly. This building, this new Islamic building, is a late 19th century building. It's the Awqaf Ministry. Awqaf is the religious endowment, and it was actually a very important institution in Egyptian urbanism because the way a lot of the development that you see in this part of the city was actually paid for and maintained was through endowments that link urban property with agricultural land. For example, so what that meant is that the builder, whoever built this building, for example, may have had land across the river in Giza, which was still an agricultural part of the city, and the rents from the building, because there was a rent-based real estate also economy, which is very important to keep in mind. The rents.
What do you mean exactly?
Meaning it wasn't about home ownership, it was all about rent. This was the case all the way up until the 60s, where the state itself actually tried to turn more towards ownership, which I think hasn't been the best thing that happened. But the rents for a property in downtown would pay for the investment and maintenance of the land, and then the products from the land, which would be sold in the city, would also pay for the maintenance of the building. So there was this kind of cycle. I mean, this is a really reductive narrative, but I mean, just to give you an idea of this relationship between city and countryside. And so this institution was actually the management institution of this. And this happens for religious sites, real estate sites. I think it's a genius system. It doesn't rely on taxation. This was completely stopped and ended in the 60s as part of the state's attempt to control and sort of manage all kinds of institutions that would pose a threat to its management of because obviously, if you can imagine, landowners pose a threat to power, but also the idea of such a massive institution like Awqaf, which I think again might talk about because of where we're going. There's a lot of Awqaf property, but anyway, so this is an important thing to just keep in mind. We'll walk quickly to another square, and I'll say a few points there. And you were running behind me. So let's be quick. A little bit so I can minimize yelling, but I'll just say a couple of points here in this square. We're in Bab el-Lut Square. Bab el-Lut was Bab means gate. It wasn't necessarily where there was an actual city gate at one point. The term Bab is also used for entry points into the city. So, for example, where the train station is Bab el-Hadid, not because there was a gate, but it's because there was Bab el-Hadid. Okay, so Bab el-Hadid and Bab el-Lut, these are sort of markers of, I would assume, sort of roughly a periphery of the old city. But anyway, this square As you can see, it was a square, now it's a parking lot, which is what I wanted to talk about, is this idea of what can we do today as designers and as policymakers with these kinds of spaces? I mean, is it possible to actually accommodate the need for parking and the need for public space in one spot? I think this space particularly really showcases the possibility. If you just go one level down for parking and I'll open up the surface for public space, it won't be the most ridiculous, most expensive project in the world. It's doable. This was an important public transport terminus. Had a major tram station that was torn down, I think, already by the 50s. It didn't survive for too long. The station building was there, and the tram line, there were several tram lines that intersected here. One came from Tahrir and across down Asr al-Aini Street, and another one went this way into Ahmed Din Street, where we're going. So it has that kind of history. But the other particular building that I wanted us to look at quickly is this one. This is the market for Bab el-Lut. I don't know if you can make out the date. I think it says 1915 or 13, something like this. It's one of 3 markets that are on the central, that sort of border the downtown central area. It's the idea of sort of the typical early 20th century, late 19th century city market. This is the Carrefour of 1915, where you go for chicken and vegetables and all that kind of thing. Obviously, these kinds of buildings in other cities have been the center of various kinds of urban regeneration projects, where the state would work with the sort of the stakeholders in that kind of building, with the community, to sort of come up with a regenerative project. I'm just saying this again, just like the square, the potentials are there. It just needs activation, and it needs people to actually frame the issue in that way. So I'm just sort of putting some ideas and reflections that I have, but there's no necessarily, I'm not pointing that there's any sort of work in progress in these projects. It can stay this way for another 100 years if nobody actually does something about it. But it could be potentially very useful projects. So from here, let's walk to Abdeen Square quickly. Abdeen Square is just down this street, and it's the main square in front of the 19th century seat of power. Maybe I'll just talk about it once we get there. Yep. No.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, there we go. We're in Abdeen Square. Abdeen is the name of the palace. Nobody named Abdeen lived in the palace. It's named Abdeen because of who owned the land on which the palace is built, which is an interesting thing. It's not like, it's not named after the monarch. It's actually named after whoever was the landowner, from whom the land was bought to build the palace. Okay. The square was also named the Jumhuriya Square at one point in the 1950s after the revolution of 52 or coup d'etat of 52. Jumhuriya Square also functioned for several years as the parade ground for the military regime of the 50s to sort of do its military celebrations. The first year they tried it in Tahrir Square. But it was interesting because they found the space very difficult to control, and we have pictures, and it's in the press. You can find it in the press from the 50s. So after 1953, they said we can't do it in Tahrir. It's too difficult to control as a space. So this is a much more contained space, as you can see. It's smaller and also has clearer edges and entries and exits. So it was easier to control. Just like just to throw it out there, the monarchy right before it ended was going on sort of an urban, let's call it renewal project. And that project included erecting new statues in this part of the city, one of which already had a huge pedestal built right here in the middle of the square, and it was going to have a statue of, we think, Fuad. I have a picture of the statue. It was already finished. Ismail's statue is going to be in Tahrir Square, whose name is, Tahrir was called Ismailiyya Square before. So there was this kind of ornamental renewal program for the city, and all the statues were supposed to have eye contact with each other. There was this kind of, it gives you a sense of how the monarchy was trying to present itself. Of course, a lot of these projects were not completed because of what happened in 52. So just a quick point on the palace. The palace is the seat of power in the 19th century. Up until 1870, the Egyptian monarch had their residence and the seat of power at the citadel. So it was also a symbolic move to go from a militarized, higher up, secluded part of the city into the sort of the level of the city as the city was expanding, as the plan was laid for this part of the city. So it's a symbolic move, and it's a move that you find in, let's say, in other Ottoman, especially Istanbul itself, when the seat of power is also shifted from an isolated, gated kind of campus, the peninsula of Old Istanbul, into Dolmabahce Palace, which was on the river. So there is that kind of parallel as well. But for me, what I think is most significant in the square is one of the most sustained interventions since the revolution of 2011 happened is Elshahed Midan, which is a street festival that happens on the first Saturday of every month, and it happens in this square. The first Saturday of every month, a stage is set and there are performers, people are selling crafts. It's the kind of your idea of a street fair, and it's been sustained, which I hope it continues. And the interesting thing about Fun Midan, not that it's the first kind of street festival, there has been street festivals in Maadi, called the Rasif, for example, and in Korba Festival, but again, these are relatively upper class areas. So the interesting thing of doing this kind of street festival in here is it mostly brings in people from Abdeen and downtown, relatively lower income residents, with people coming from out of town, other parts of the city. So it's a new kind of interaction space. And I think it's a symbolic victory, let's say, for civil society to be able to take such a symbolic, heavy loaded square and turn it into that kind of function. My problem with what's happening, though, is that it all depends on the charity of, is that the right word? I mean, the Abdeen district manager, he's the one that personally allows it to happen. So what that means is that if he moves, if he's out of position and someone else comes who does not like the idea of Al-Fanni Midan, then it's not going to be sustained. So this is why I'm highlighting this, not just because of what it means as far as the reuse of space, but also how vulnerable it is in light of our political situation, that it could actually just end in one day with no notice. So this is important to negotiate and keep in mind. All right, so we'll move down Ahmed Dean Street. I actually won't say much, mostly because we're running out of time and because it's a relatively long walk compared to what we've done so far. But just to say, Ahmed Dean was one of the main avenues of this part of the city. It was the entertainment sort of strip. All the famous theaters and Najib al-Rihani and so on of the early 20th century, they had their theaters and their theater companies and their cinemas that they opened independently on that strip. It also has some of downtown's older buildings. I forgot to mention that when downtown was done, unlike other sort of many other 19th century plans, it wasn't built overnight. The plan was laid out, and the land was divided and was up for auction. People, investors can buy land, and there were some specifications as to how much a building can cost. Buildings had to cost a minimum of £2,000, which in like 1870, 1880, this is a lot of money. So that guaranteed a certain quality of building is the point, but it didn't necessarily enforce a very strict aesthetic regime necessarily. This is hence the diversity of facades that you find in this part of the city, which I find to be a unique feature of Cairo. From this kind of development is what I'm trying to say. But what happened with the initial plan is that there were sort of four what have become known as the Khedival buildings, kind of sample blocks were built. And they're on Ahmed Dean Street. So again, add into the significance of that street. So we'll walk down Ahmed Dean until we hit 26th of July, which was previously known as Fuad, the name of the father of the last king. And before that it was called Bula, which is the name of the neighborhood that the street leads to. This is part of the history of this part of the city, how the street naming and the square naming actually is part of the memory and the erasure of memory, the rewriting of history, sort of which makes this part of the city particularly complex. So anyway, so we'll turn right on 26th of July to what used to be Cairo's first 19th century park, and we'll say something there. points. Obviously, this part of town, this whole myth of, or vision or narrative of cosmopolitan Cairo partly comes from the idea that it's also, I mean, it's a very contested idea because it's cosmopolitan in the sense that there were northern and southern people together, not cosmopolitan in the sense that there were also people from other places, from, let's say, Arab countries, from Africa, from Asia. It's not, so it's a particular kind of cosmopolitanism that has been celebrated. But anyway, this is just a side comment. But that's partly because of also the diversity of not only national but also religious affiliations that was in this part of the city. In the city in general, Cairo has a long history of, you know, multi-religious and multi-ethnic communities having, you know, sort of inhabited different parts of the city. But anyway, this part of town gets particularly this narrative, mostly because there were also people of European origin who had immigrated here. There were waves of immigration, two particular waves in the late 19th century that had to do with moments of economic boom in Egypt. In 1897, there was sort of a massive economic boom in Egypt, and a lot of people from particularly Greece and Italy migrated. So this was established, this building was founded or built in 1910-12, mostly for the Italian but also Egyptian Catholic community. It's currently being run both by Egyptian and French, it's a Franciscan church. Egyptian and French nuns. But I just wanted to peek here since we're here. I had nothing much else to say. But when we stand out, I want you to look at the facades of the bank buildings across the street. Square, not in Tahrir. The first square we stood at was Talat Harb Square. Talat Harb was an Egyptian banker, financier, capitalist who founded many institutions, including the first fully Egyptian-owned bank in the 1920s. And this is the headquarters of this bank. The bank also led sort of a new wave of industrialization in the early 20th century with companies and factories, mostly in the textile industry. So anyway, so what I found, just to point out what Talat Harb, who Talat Harb is, what the Bank Masri is, but also to sort of contemplate this triptych of buildings right here. This is the 1960s addition to the bank, back down there. And this is the 1980s addition to the bank. Obviously, it's an expanding bank, but I think it's a nice sort of flattened image of sort of architectural evolution in the city, and also the institution itself, the bank itself. Okay. We'll try to wrap up quickly, but just to point out, again, this is I'm at the Dean Street that I was mentioning before. If you've noticed, there's quite grand apartment buildings on it, but there are also, besides the church that we entered, the Khedival buildings, once we cross the street, you'll see domed buildings into the distance. Those are the Khedival buildings, the earlier, like the 1875 residential blocks. They're huge. Also here you have the synagogue for this part of the city that was built 1899 and then renovated in the 1920s. So its current facade is obviously more 1920s, but the building was originally from 1899. Again, pretty large for this time in this part of the world, but also even with European standards. This is part of what Khalid Fahmy was speaking about yesterday, the sort of health-oriented urban change that was done. This was a lake, and it was actually a lake around which some of the city's wealthiest houses and households were. Everybody, of course, if you think about the idea of a waterfront, of course people who wanted to live on the waterfront were the wealthiest, were the most privileged, and so on. So if you imagine that there's in the middle of the city here, what's today for us is the middle of the city, was actually a waterfront with boats and this kind of thing. The lake was dried up in the 1830s, the park was planned. This, along with Abdeen Square, where we were before, and then with the square where the train station is, are three juncture points that linked the pre-19th century with the post-19th century, or the 19th century with the pre-19th century city. So everything on this side is probably from before 1830. Everything on this side is after 1830. So there is that kind of a linking space between the two kinds of Cairos. I'm not a champion of the sort of dual city narrative. I think it's deeply flawed, but anyway, this is where this kind of place where that narrative became clear for some people in the past. So this is to identify where we are. The park underwent a redesign in the 1860s. Again, it's a very old public park, even by international standards. In the 1980s, early 90s actually, the park was then used as a spot for the metro construction to go below ground. Hence its current condition. It's been, you only see a corner of the park, but the rest of it, there are no more trees. It's all been completely destroyed, frankly, and there are no clear plans for its restoration once the metro construction is over. Below here, there is 2 metro lines that intersect, including the one that just opened last year, which is only 5 stations so far, but the other one is the one that connects Cairo east to west. The other thing to say here is that this massive garage was once the site of the Opera House, again the one that Khalid showed yesterday. The Opera House survived from 1869 when it was built until 1970, exactly 101 years, and then it magically burned, kind of like a lot of the fires we've been seeing in the last 2 years that sort of happen, unexplainable fires. This is suspicious for 2 main reasons. When it burned in 1970, it was a point of political transition. It's when Nasser died and Sadat took over, and there was a lot of apparently, this is the myth, we don't really have the real reasons, but apparently it was a political fire. And the reason I say this because the Opera House had its own fire department that was part of the design from the very beginning because it was a wood building. So from the very beginning, there was an on-site 24-hour fire department. And the main fire department for the whole city is just behind it. I initially wanted our walk to just walk behind into Ataba Square, but we don't have time. But Ataba Square is another major square where there's another market like the one we saw in Bab el-Louq, and it's also where the city's post office is, 19th century post office, and fire department are. So it's a very central key square. The square has been pretty much ruined with the idea of Mubarak-esque traffic control, which is all about overpasses. You'll see the overpass over there that goes over the middle of the square, completely ruins it. But I'll talk more about this when we get on the bus and go to Zamalek. Just behind us is one of the city's oldest and largest hotels. This is the Continental Hotel, which was built also as early as the 1870s. Just down the street was the Shepherd's Hotel, which burned down in the 1952 also political fires. The Continental Hotel, the important thing to remember for me is that one is government owned, so there's no reason for it to be this way. They have not sought any investment to use it as a regenerative project for the area. They claim that it's collapsing, which it does not look like it to me. And in fact, illegally inside, people who are working for the government, they rent space for workshops, for small factories and this kind of activity, which is not really legal, and sort of keeping the building suspended like this. It's or in Arabic we say بتلج صح ولا بنقول ايه؟ يعني بيتلجوا الbuilding. Like refrigerating, the idea of refrigerating the building, you just like extend its life without really doing anything to it. You're not eating it and you're not throwing it in the garbage. You know, it's just there. This is what's happening to this building. I just wanted to take note of these kinds of things. If anybody wants to, after this trip, talk to people, write, articles or whatever, these are the kinds of things that I'm trying to sort of generate with this walk. So, okay, we'll cross now with the pedestrian tunnel, one of the few that were done here because they put this fence, so they realized at one point that people need to cross, so then they made a tunnel. So we'll take it and then we'll get on to the bus. Built actually it took about 9 years to build this building for many financial reasons and so on, but anyway, it was finally opened in 1934. It was won by a competition. It was then done as something called the mixed courts, which has to do with this multinational, multi-ethnic makeup of this part of the city and Egyptian society at the time, where mixed courts meant that Egyptians and non-Egyptians had to deal with 2 different kinds of legal systems. There was a privilege given to non-Egyptians basically, and the mixed court was for that. The system stayed until 1949 when the monarchy, not the republic, canceled the mixed courts and made everybody equal. which was actually one of the main reasons why many of the non-Egyptian elites who had privileges here decided as early as 1949 to leave the country. Not in big waves, but obviously subsequent events led to further migration. Okay, so from here we're gonna go into Zamalek. We're not gonna get off the bus until we get to the second half of the tour, which is sort of a walking tour in so-called Islamic Cairo, or the old part of the city. But up until then, we will pass by bus through a couple of the, let's say, 20th century neighborhoods. One is Zamalek, which was an island that was urbanized mostly from the 1920s upwards. The main street is actually an extension of the street we're on, not as a straight line, but it's also 26th of July Street. And as you can imagine, that was the main street. It had a tram that crossed from here. And so the buildings that were built on it were quite grand as well, because there was the avenue of Zamalek, of the newly urbanized elite district. Of course, you'll see that today Zamalek has, on that very same street that had that kind of status, has an overpass, which completely kills the urban fabric in ways, and the social fabric, and also reduces the value of buildings. And I mean, you once upon a time lived on a grand street, and now you open your window and you have cars zooming by, of course. I mean, if Jane Jacobs was in Egypt, you know, let's say in the 70s when this was done, this would be her case. I mean, what was done in Egypt at this time is not unusual. It was also done in places in the US, in Europe, where the idea of building a highway to sort of connect different parts of the city and to privilege the cars was not an uncommon thing. It's just in some places it was fought more than others. I think those battles weren't really fought enough here, and then hence we failed to sort of stop this kind of development. Okay, I'll stop. It's very contentious. Along this entire stretch where the bus is driving, until I tell you where it stops, there's actually a waterfront promenade that's constructed, but it hasn't been open to the public. Only about 100 meters of it is open to the public, which is a huge problem, and it has to do with economic segregation. If you look closely, you'll see these big boats. They're not really boats, they're just, I don't know what to call them. They're like, what do you call them? Like floating restaurants. They're floating restaurants that obviously target a very particular economic strata. Mostly, I mean, there are restaurants like Chili's and this kind of thing, where, you know, a meal is going to be like 50 to 100 pounds minimum. So obviously it's for a particular kind of market. So the free promenade along the waterfront that's already constructed passes in front of these restaurants. And in order to keep these economic strata separate, the waterfront is closed. So it's not that the waterfront is not there, it's there, it's already paved, it's ready, it just needs to be opened, and it's been like this for 20 years or so. All of this down here by the water, there is a promenade ready to be used today.
There's more water?
Right by the water. Oh, yeah, sorry. To the left and right of the window, you'll see these massive supports. That's because right above us is a massive, basically, highway. This is what I was talking about before. But this was the main spine of the neighborhood, as the sort of the most public street of the neighborhood, let's say, as opposed to the smaller back streets where things become a bit more communal. And it was recently urbanized. It's actually a new island in the sense that, like 150 years ago, the island wasn't what it is today. It was three separate islands that shifted shape as the Nile moved. But again, when the Nile River was stabilized on the bank where we started, which would be the east bank, Zamalek was also slowly prepared for urbanization, mostly because the Khedive, for the same occasion where many of the 19th century plans were done, which is the opening of the Suez Canal, built a palace here in Zamalek to host the French Queen, which is today the Marriott Hotel. But it's really from there on that the neighborhood began to emerge. But it's a mostly 1920s onwards part of the city. It's relatively it's relatively upper class, upper middle class. and upper class. But what's interesting for me to always point out in these kinds of in these parts of Cairo is that the fact that municipal management is just as bad here as it is in. I mean, of course, there's drastic differences. I mean, there's infrastructure, there's running water, there's sewage, yes, and many other parts of the city maybe don't have them quite as well. But I'm talking about municipal management, like street cleaning, like maintenance, like trimming trees, like, you know, the things that municipalities do. They're just as bad in this part of the city as other neighborhoods that might not be as well off, which is an interesting thing, again, to keep in mind, that it isn't sort of a Mexico City model where there's a clear, visible distinction in municipal management between well-off neighborhoods from not so well-off neighborhoods. This is not the case. Everybody here is a loser in a way when it comes to municipal management. Full of a family that actually spent some money to renovate a building. Mostly it's been prohibited or prohibitive for people to do this, even if they have the money, because taxation will come right after you. The government doesn't actually encourage people to spend on their property and upgrade them. They basically discourage it by raising your taxes, coming after you with property value issues, and it just becomes too messy. So people don't bother. So you'll go often inside of these buildings and you'll find incredible interiors, but really, not the best conditions for the outside. 1965, but it still works, and it's still actually an efficient mode of transport if you know where to go for it and where you might be able to use it. This one crosses to Imbaba, and then you can actually take it all the way up to the north of Cairo and all the way down to Maadi. Actually, it could be a fantastic form of transport. Only recently, when a private company started the Nile taxi, the government has been talking about reinvesting in the Nile bus again. But just a few things to say. If look to the side, all of this is very expensive for the average person. Actually, even for me, even if I can afford it, I don't want to go sit at most of these places. So it completely takes away this space from usage for a public. The waterfront is almost entirely privatized. It's a military mentality, which is, it's either ours or ours as in the military. Ours or people that we like. So even if there are sections that are not developed, they're just simply shut off. I have no idea what the mentality behind this is. A lot of things, if everything had a reason, life would be so much easier, but there are actually a lot of things that don't have reasons. But the other thing that you find along the waterfront is what I consider to be sort of a buy-off, how the political order buys off particular segments of society, professional society. So you'll find clubs for, this is the judges club. Somebody yesterday in the question session was saying if the judges are basically stealing public land to make it for themselves, then there's a big problem here. The same for the mostly military related or police related or law related social clubs that actually have nothing to do with the neighborhood. The residents of Zamalek are not the ones using them. There are people that come from all over the city with their cars and everything, and they create a traffic issue, and they take up a part of the waterfront that should be available to everyone. So anyways, it's a very compounded issue. And a very contested issue. Across the water, since we're here, I might as well mention it, there are these wooden houses that are floating. It's a very Cairo feature, which I'm sure it's not unique. I'm sure there are, at least in Southeast Asia, but this is a famous feature of this part of Cairo. They're called awamet. They're floating houses. Some of them, some of the novels of Naguib Mahfouz are set in them. It's a place where in the 19-teens, the Sayyid is the quintessential family man, who sort of represents Egyptian masculinity, and whenever will escape his family to come to Awama to have some time with the belly dancers and the drinking and the fun. So this is the sort of the popular media or the popular narrative of the Awama, but it's also just an interesting typology for residential space, domestic space. That's a water tank.
What is that?
Of course, if you listen to the big planners, they'll say, "Oh, we have to get rid of the Awama," not as opposed to as opposed to actually look at them as a unique Cairene thing and develop them or keep them as part of them. Okay, so now we've crossed away from Zamalek over the narrower branch of the Nile in the middle of the city. And we'll do a quick loop through Mohandisin, or Abuza, and Du'i. These are the areas that were developed also in the 20th century on the west bank of the Nile. Like I said, everything on this side of the river was agricultural up until very recently. In fact, most of this land was part of the Awqaf that I mentioned when we were downtown. And it was known as Aradi al-Awqaf, lands of Awqaf, or lands of the religious endowment. And already as early as the 1940s, Awqaf was already flirting with the idea of urbanizing this part of the city under its patronage. I mean, it was basically the Awqaf as an institution was already... Sorry? Oh, it's right now there's the flower show. It's worth coming to see. I came, I actually enjoyed it, and I think part of the problem for why these kinds of... This is a historic garden, and it was a botanical garden from the also 18... The zoo was done 1890, and the garden was done just before it, so but together they're basically 1890 gardens, and there was a water stream that links the two, where now it's bisected by a street. The garden is in bad shape, I will admit this, but I think it only gets worse as more and more middle class people refuse to go to these kinds of places because they're not clean enough, because they're not cool enough. You cannot just wait, I think, as a middle class for things to be nice and pretty and then go consume them. You actually have to demand this, and you have to let go, and you have to make it heard. Otherwise, nobody's going to do anything for you. So I think forgetting about the park and not coming to it is probably the worst that could happen. This is iconic because it's in films, it's in our heritage, and I think it defies all the stereotypical narratives about Cairo as a city that never had public space or never had gardens, or that these are European interventions. This is not the mosque statue by Mahmoud Mukhtar. It was moved here in the 50s. Further down, the massive dome is the main lecture hall of Cairo University, and next to us right here is the Giza Zoo, which is again one of the world's actually oldest public zoos, 1890, like I said. So this is a very important part of the city, but again, somehow it doesn't get I think the attention it deserves, neither from the authorities, but neither from those who should be using these kinds of spaces. I mean, you would think the university, with its massive student body, would provide enough ammunition to populate these spaces and to activate them, but that's not what's happening. This is now the main stretch of the Nile. This is University Bridge, 1960s and 70s construction. There's a Gold's Gym right there with a Ruby Tuesday below it, which I think is a really funny combination of things. Anyway, this is, I think, a really telling skyline of the city. We've seen the Tower of Shame right there, the round tower. The skeletal thing right to its right is something that the military built that supposedly cost 20 million pounds, and they built it in 2011 to commemorate the revolution. Obviously, there were 20 million pounds missing in the budget, so they had to build something for it. The Cairo Tower is 1958. Supposedly CIA bribes that was then put together to build the tower to say, no, we're not going to do whatever the CIA wants. The Saudi embassy back there, biggest embassy after the American embassy. It's very telling that the two biggest embassies are the Saudi and the American. I'm trying to just throw as many anecdotes as possible from what we're looking at. And now we're crossing back to the east bank of the river, and we're about to slowly, surely, but important. We're actually on the other urbanized island that I mentioned before. Zamalek is the northern one. This is Manian or Roda, which is a much more middle class and very densely populated and urbanized island. It's one of my favorite, I think, residential areas in the city, mostly because more than many other places, it still has, once you get onto the actual streets, it has much more of a cohesive community. You can tell there's The social fabric wasn't as fragmented as in many other places. People haven't moved out as much as maybe they did from other middle class areas, and that might have to do with the fact that it's an island. I'm not sure, but it's a very interesting place. And there's a lot of sites in the southern tip of this island. If anybody has an extra time who's visiting, or even if you live in Cairo but you haven't been, there's yes, what the hell is it called? The Nilometer, which is one of the two oldest sites in the city from the Islamic or whatever period. It's a device that you can actually enter. It's so big you can enter to measure the water level. And next to it is the Kulthum Museum and then the Ministerial Palace. So there's some interesting sites to visit at the southern tip of this island. And just up here on the right is the Mohamed Ali Jr. Palace, which had, it's a 1920s building. I never talked about really architectural style so much in this trip, but I think the point that this palace just reminds me of is the sort of eclecticism that was happening in the first decade and a half, 2 decades of the 20th century. This is a building that has Moorish, Mamluk, some Italianate, some Ottoman references, and it sort of becomes this like mix of elements. It also had its own botanical garden. It was transformed into several things in its lifetime.
Is this open or is it closed?
It's supposed to be open. Yeah. No? It's supposed to be open.
مش كل حاجة.
البارك.
البارك بس الميوزيوم
لا بس البارك.
The building والجولدن هون is closed till now.
No, of course, but the park is open. Because it's the first modern medical institution in this part of the world. The current building, there are several buildings. This is not the main building. This is a 1998, I'm not sure, medical facility, but the main university section is actually back on Manian, where we just crossed from. And it has a medical museum, which for the Egyptians who are in town, please go see the medical museum. I mean, if you also are visiting and have time, you should check it out. Yeah, it has things in jars.